Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab.
Good morning, everybody. This is John Hamry. The results of a major about China. You know, Washington about China, really that same, and how different segments of America think, residents think about it. Americans outside of Washington really done that through a series of surveys. Mike Green, Dr. Mike, we've uncovered very interesting presentation and all of our colleagues.
I'm going to provide you with my fellow team by sending your questions to us as the results of our CSIS.org right now from the CSIS board. It's the broad consensus in the United States. Competition is supposed to use for some time, and the values strategy. We did three. We had a sample of 1,000, and you can find that at the survey. We cooperated with the congressional staff in the U.S.-China relationship, answered exactly the way you can with a public expert opinion. In 16 countries in question we have about how to approach China, will have to be built if we're whom we stand alone. 5 takeaways from the wide margin that it is the country that poses the greatest challenge to the United States. Second, is through increased collaboration among like partners to counter China is the most important approach. 5% said we need to prioritize allies and partners. Of great power relations with the United States, we should prioritize cooperation with China, even if it hurts, with allies and partners, and internationalize, not unilateral. Do want U.S. international cooperation, but for their India and so forth. Kennedy can get into some of those, and you can explore them in all the surveys. With over 2/3 of thought current policy of some of these governments, but a very 71% of U.S. national security and economic thought leaders. And the consensus is similar about banning. Among those countries with the most advanced, a very strong potential consortium is also shared among other allies and partners, with 56%. Just thought leaders expressed confidence that markets are the best way to the United States, Asia, and Europe, together with pressure Beijing to abide by its commitments or change its or include transatlantic agreements. That's a subject for a lot of economically seen as the most effective among a very large majority of thought leaders in all sectors to confronting China's economic policies. And 71% of thought leaders, 1%. Public is a little more spread out, reflecting polarization in our country. 42% have been effective in producing some tactical changes in Chinese economic policy. Say 50% consensus among thought leaders who follow China policy from different sectors and different particular problem. Our fourth takeaway. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 meaning take 7 or higher, and the mean for the public was 6. Thought leaders in the United States were somewhat less willing to take risk, most willing to take risk in the South China and Europe are confident that the US would come to the defense of allies and partners in Asia. Our East Asian allies, those that would actually come under attack, Japan, Korea, are the most confident. And it's our European allies here. First, our allies on the front lines in Asia has a gap in the transatlantic dialogue on China. American thought leaders think we will do with respect to crises. We had over 400 thought leaders respond, and it's specific today, who would prevail? And the answer was 79%. Thought leaders in East Asia who said we would prevail was higher than the number of Europe and Asia. That number drops when we asked who would prevail, up, including efforts to develop advanced assets, such as working together, particularly among thought leaders in Asia. Asia thought a war with China was very unlikely. Fully half of young Americans thought a war with China, a conflict throughout the polling of the American public about China. In what areas? And forward air and naval presence. Our fifth major takeaway from across the surveys, US public. As you can see, meaning worth putting other priorities at significant risk, there is strong support among the US, Europe, China, specifically to promote human rights and civil liberties in Hong Kong and the rights of ethnic minorities in regions like Xinjiang, protect the human rights of Chinese dissidents. Overall, the results suggest there is a broad convergence on the real opportunity now to develop an international framework for addressing China's human rights violations. Interestingly, 49% of thought leaders in the US, 51% of those in the business community supported this, and in some parts in our survey of American thought leaders, those engaged in civil society, plurality, 40% of leaders in civil society and scholarly exchange, including university presidents whom we interviewed. Our read on this is that these professionals rely on access to China for their work, but are also more likely to see the possibility for change at a grassroots level, could operationalize by coordinating with like-minded allies on a set of actions that could be taken jointly to address violations by China of human rights, but there are important variations, as I just pointed out. We encourage you to burrow into the surveys. It's interactive. You can jump from a question and analysis on what European thought leaders think beginning to end. We've designed the questions so that we can do data visualization that allows the user to explore specific policy issues in a linear way or panel for some analysis. The team that pulled this together, in addition to Nick St. Cheney, who's the experts who helped design the questions, reach out to our National Association partner, Blanchett, the Freeman Chair in China Studies.
Thanks, Mike. And just a quick note, I know team, so hopefully those are worked out pretty quickly. But apologies for anyone who's not getting the. I think the fun thing for me, and I know everyone else who was involved in the project, is we really did the alignment on what are the traditional demarcations, or what is the spec politics is clearly evolving or breaking down, and we're in the midst of a paradigm shift where we don't have a new but as Mike highlighted, I think we see a lot of outcomes here that both confirm where consensus may be. I just wanted to highlight one issue and then add a follow-on thought to what Mike just discussed in terms of the takeaways on the current deterioration in bilateral relations. This is one I think folks following this and folks who are reading the big think pieces, a lot of the rise of Xi Jinping. In contradistinction, we see a lot of how the U.S. public, thought leaders, and allies and partners are diagnosing this. For allies and partners, it was interesting that it wasn't the top choice that made a confrontation inevitable. And related to this, in my opinion, was the second top choice, which was a more assertive Chinese military and foreign policy. What we weren't suspect, this is a shift that people see beginning in and around 2008, 2009, 2010, which again lends itself to this diagnosis that where we are in the bilateral relationship is really drawing on deeper tectonic plates, which slipped, so to speak, in and around 2015, 2016, 2017. That lends it to, I think, a belief that we're seeing a more enduring rivalry, and not one which will shift with a shift in administrations here in the United States. I would say a shift in administrations in China, but that ain't going to happen anytime soon with Xi Jinping in power. Looking at the more personalist elements here, when allies and partners are diagnosing which individuals are to blame, or what are the more near-term elements at work here, they seem to be, allies and partners seem to be pointing the finger at the Trump administration more than they do the Xi administration, with 50% of allies and partners pointing at the Trump administration for being the proximate cause of the downturn in relations versus 35% who see the more aggressive Xi Jinping authoritarian playbook as the cause here. Contrasting that with US thought leaders, which when given the ability to rank order three choices, the leading choice at 24% was the Trump administration, with China's assertive military and foreign policy coming in second at 15%. So here in the United States, we're seeing more an assertion that it's the Trump administration that is causing this than these structural forces. When we break that
7, so almost really as high as Korea and Japan. I thought that was really interesting to me, and I think this is partly a function of growing concern in the United States about China and the Chinese challenges, threats, not only to the US, but of course also to our allies and to countries in the region. But even more than that, perhaps, it is, I think, a function of the growing awareness about Taiwan in the United States. Increased understanding, for example, of Taiwan's exemplary performance in fighting the spread of COVID-19, which, by the way, Taiwan has done without lockdowns and a very, very small number of deaths. And life is pretty normal right now in Taiwan, which it certainly is not in most places in the United States. So I think that this is something that is a major shift we have now seen. And we found even higher support for defending Taiwan against military threats from China among US thought leaders. So those statistics, again, a little bit higher, 7.93 for coming to Taiwan's defense. So it's interesting to see that this support for Taiwan is much more substantial than it was even 1 year ago. And I think that should be reassuring to Taiwan, and perhaps might also shape the policy of the next administration, regardless of whether it is a second Trump or Biden administration, about how to proceed in our policy toward Taiwan going forward. It affects, for example, the debate maybe over whether the US should continue to have a position of strategic ambiguity about whether or not it should come to Taiwan's defense if attacked. And I recently wrote an article that responded to a very important and stimulating article in Foreign Affairs by Richard Haas and his co-author. So this is a topic that I think will continue to be discussed for some time. I hope everybody will dig into this data a little bit more deeply. Thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. Bonnie mentioned the really excellent survey work, polling work by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And many of you will have seen the recent Pew surveys on views of China. We have done our own surveys of thought leaders in Asia for 10 years now, every 2-3 years. So we have a pretty good baseline there. But we do, throughout the report, reference other polling data to see how much our results track with the work of others. We have more detailed questions across more sectors on China policy by far, but we do try wherever possible to footnote and cite polls as Bonnie just did, so people have the context of whether ours is out of line with what others are finding. Let me turn next to Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics.
Well, thanks, Mike. Let me offer a big thanks of gratitude to CSIS for supporting this project, to Mike for your leadership, and to Mike, Bonnie, Jude, and our other colleagues at CSIS who collaborated with us on this project. This is a strategic look at a strategic issue. On economics, what the survey shows is that we are in a new era. China says it's in a new era under Xi Jinping, and the US is in a new era on China policy. And the data shows a real spectrum shift of views in the United States and around the world on economic and commercial issues. Let me discuss briefly 3 takeaways from the data and a point about what the data does not address. So first of all, in terms of US goals, Americans and others around the world have given up on the idea that the goal should be to change China into a free market economy, to have its economic system converge with the rest of the world. Instead, 66% of US thought leaders from different parts of the United States emphasize that the dominant goal ought to be to have China abide by its international commitments. Only 14% say the goal should be to have China become a free market economy. That, though, I think we should understand, is not suggesting that we want China to just follow the letter of the law. In fact, we want China to follow the spirit of the international system, including reciprocity. And folks don't want China to continue to game the economic system to their advantage. The second takeaway is what not to do. The survey shows that folks are really against a unilateralist approach to dealing with China on economic issues. 42% of the American public thinks the administration's unilateralist approach has damaged US economic interests. Only 10% believe the US actually has gotten any progress in pushing long-term change in China. 71% of US thought leaders have the same opinions, even more uniform views about this. In addition, though, folks are also against unconditional engagement and cooperation with China. There was very little support for this among thought leaders or the American public, and even with allies. Only 4% of US thought leaders stress that the top priority for US policy with China on economic issues should be cooperation. Instead, 81% stressed cooperation with allies and partners. And so, as Mike said at the outset, this is not a support for the idea of a new model of great power relations or an American equivalent. Third point, what should the US do? I think the survey, even though there's not a full consensus amongst different groups, gives a green light to what we might call a Goldilocks policy on economics. Hard-nosed, but willing to place discrete unilateral restrictions where needed, but not eliminating connectivity. Only 19% of US thought leaders and a similar number of the American public and thought leaders from Europe and Asia favor decoupling, full outright decoupling. Instead, folks are willing to have decoupling with a small d in very limited specific places, but broadly want to cooperate multilaterally and with each other in managing the China challenge. And so, as I mentioned, and so there is support, as Mike said at the outset, significant support for banning Huawei's telecom equipment from markets in the United States and other countries around the world. That was almost universally supported everywhere. It was surprising to see that this is not just an American concern. At the same time, you see very, very high support, 72% of US national security and business economic leaders for collaborating with others around the world, and the same for our friends elsewhere. So I think support for collaboration, but targeted sanctions and penalties, particularly in telecom. Let me say one thing, a little bit about what the data does not answer. The first is, how tentative is this consensus for a Goldilocks approach? I think this would be very, very tricky to pull off. It's going to require alignment among stakeholders in the United States, within the US government, and with allies. And as the data shows, in Congress, amongst human rights groups, labor organizations, and the public, they have more ambitious goals about and fears about China and less patience than other groups. We can also see that trying to thread the needle for a Goldilocks approach could become partisan. Right now, there doesn't seem to be as clear partisan divide on standing up to China, but when you say how to do it, you could see those partisan differences show through. In addition, countries around the world are not all on the same page. There are several countries in Southeast Asia, Italy, and the UK that want to remain neutral in a US-China slugfest. While on the other side, Vietnam and Taiwan, there's more support in both for decoupling because of the long-term concerns that they've had about over-dependence. And so we may aim for consensus on handling China, but we may end up with a workable coalition. And that's going to require a lot of effort on the United States. We're going to need to have a national dialogue on China, on economic issues actually, I should say we're going to need an international dialogue. I think we're going to talk about several issues in that dialogue. How statist and dangerous is China's economy to the rest of the world? How connected are all of us to China? What are those benefits and harms that we face? What would be the net benefits and costs of decoupling and other policies? Because so far, we've not done the math on the costs and benefits of these different policies. And then, how are we going to cooperate with each other around the world, not just in an ad hoc way, not just between the US, the EU, and Japan during occasional meetings, but in a full, true coalition? We're going to need new rules, regional and global, to deal with the China challenge for a very long time. So I think that's what the data shows and the challenge that it presents to us that we're going to have to work out in the coming months and years. Let me stop there. Mike?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I think the line you used, we have an opportunity for a workable coalition, is the right way to put it. There is, on the whole, if you think of China policy as a kind of Venn diagram, there is on the whole much more overlap than not with allies and partners, and especially within the United States, a lot more overlap than one would think given the current debate about China in the context of the presidential election. You would think, listening to our two candidates, that there's a fundamental division over China in this country. The survey suggests that on a thought leader level and on a public opinion level, that is not true, or to the extent it's true, it reflects partisan politics and the indictment or praise for the Trump administration's performance. So presumably after the election, we will be in a better position when the heat's down a bit to have the national dialogue Scott's talking about. And to talk about that and the congressional angle, I'm going to turn to Louis Lauder, our Vice President for Congressional and Government Affairs and a China scholar in his own right. Louis?
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. I know we want to get to Q&A quickly, so I'll be brief. And yeah, I completely ascribe myself to the comments that you just made. I'm very interested in the politics surrounding China, and particularly on the Hill, where there's been a lot of work most recently. And yes, when you look at the campaign environment, you see at the presidential level, arguments over who is closer to President Xi. You see Cold War, type paradigm, Cold War type language, on the campaign trail, down ballot at the congressional level. A couple weeks ago, I was watching the Senate debate for the Arizona Senate seat between Martha McSally and Mark Kelly, and China was a prominent issue there. She was accusing him of doing business with China. He's a former astronaut. She accused him of bringing a flag that had a Chinese emblem into outer space. Very sort of heated stuff. In Congress, if you're looking at actual work in Congress, on the surface, it also may seem somewhat partisan. You have there was an effort early this spring to develop a bipartisan task force in the House on China policy. That collapsed. Out of that came a Republican effort that actually came out with a report last week with a couple hundred recommendations. In the Senate, you have two separate comprehensive broad China strategy bills that were introduced in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one with Republicans, one with Democrats. So it looks like it's a fairly partisan dynamic, and that doesn't really jive well with the kind of consensus that we see, especially in the public opinion survey in this effort. But if you actually unpack that a little bit, you do see that there is quite a bit of consensus, even on in these partisan efforts. The two bills I mentioned and the task force report, there's just tons of policy overlap. especially in areas of working with allies and partners on economic and security issues, strengthening military deterrence, and on human rights and democracy. My colleague Scott Kennedy, who you just heard from, he's done some really great work on looking at what's been coming out of Congress legislatively, and he's tracked over about 366 pieces of legislation that are China focused, and I believe that was 12 of those bills have become law, which is significant in any Congress to have 12 bills on one issue become law. And all of those 12 bills had significant bipartisan support in those areas I discussed: human rights, democracy, working with allies and partners, military deterrence, and then some of the economic issues that we've been reaching here. So, why is there more consensus than it seems on the political trail? Well, it's because public opinion matters to members of Congress. And so I was really interested to look into the details of this survey, because you see, on some of the other surveys, you saw some broader sort of approaches to China, but here you got to really dig into sort of policy solutions. And it's interesting how where the consensus exists, that there's alignment in Congress in a bipartisan way. And you start with the 54% in the survey that that agreed that thought that China was the greatest challenge. That's and it was far more than, I think Russia was 22%. That shows that there's sort of a political push, a political force there, and it explains to some degree the amount of energy that exists in Congress to tackle the China challenge. 45% of plurality prioritize working with allies and partners on security issues. You see much of the work in Congress focus on that space. A willingness to take significant risks to defend allies and partners, a range of between 6.38 and 6.97 on a scale of 1 to 10 across, maybe looking at Taiwan, Australia, Japan, South China Sea. Strong support for taking some risk on that front, and you see significant congressional action in support of defending allies and partners, especially Taiwan, which has always been a large priority for members of Congress as an institution that advocates for Taiwan. And then on human rights, a mean response of 6.79 on a scale of 1 to 10 to take risk to support human rights when it comes to China. And you see tremendous activity on human rights in Congress, including significant legislation that has recently been passed both on Hong Kong and the situation in Xinjiang. So the one area I would say where there's more division and it leads to sort of more questions for the future is on the economic front. In our survey, there was a bit of a split on prioritizing between using international agreements and rules to compete with China or pressure China, or using more unilateral tools. I think that division you see in Congress as well. But what you see right now in terms of the legislative activity is consensus around kind of broader issues of increasing domestic competition. There's general support for working with allies and partners, but no rubber meets the road decisions quite yet. Certainly supply chain security is growing important. It is an issue growing in importance there, but it's not the typical divisions you see over trade haven't developed yet, though that could certainly happen down the road. The last thing I just want to mention is, if you look at Congress 15 years ago, 10 years ago, there was a smaller group focused on China policy, but there was a significant group, but you could divide them up in different camps. You had the security-minded military side, you had human rights activists, you had the free traders, you had the economic nationalists. But we see today is sort of a convergence on China policy with all those groups. There's a common recognition of the challenge, and there seems to be broad agreement on solutions in some areas. What will be interesting to see down the road is whether new groups may emerge once the policy evolves. If there's a new multilateral, if a new administration comes in and there's a new push for a multilateral trade deal in Asia, will that create new divisions? If there's an effort to cooperate more with China on climate change, will that create new divisions as well? So, there's a lot to still learn, but I think there is really interesting alignment between public opinion and what Congress is working on, which I think will extend past the campaign season when some of the more partisanship that we see these days recedes. So, with that, Mike, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Let me get to some questions. One participant asked about the new North Korean missile they showed off in Pyongyang yesterday, and whether the survey tells us anything about U.S.-China cooperation on the North Korean problem. In fact, we did ask a number of questions about where the U.S. should be cooperating with China. And in the rank order of those issues, climate change is number one by a pretty wide margin, followed by global health, for obvious reasons. Scholarly exchange, North Korea is number 4. Only 9% of respondents thought it was the most important issue. When I was the senior Asia person on the NSC staff in the Bush administration, I think that would have been the number 1 issue 16 years ago, 15 years ago. But it's not now. So let me, Bonnie, if you could pick that one up for us. What do you see in the survey, and what do you see as the prospects for U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea?
Well, you have the data handy on this. I do not, but I do recall that younger people are far more concerned about North Korea. So going back to the issue of the differences between younger and older people, we of course had 4 different age cohorts, but it was interesting to me that North Korea was a greater concern for younger people. But I think that in terms of the prospects for cooperation, there is a potential for a Biden administration. And I think actually the vice president has said, although not recently, but I think early on during the primary, he did say that the United States should work together with China to try and denuclearize North Korea, that China is a player, basically. It can't be ignored. And maybe the Trump administration, if they get a second chance, will try to re-engage with Kim Jong-un, and will see that China has perhaps more just a disruptive role to play rather than a cooperative role. But I think it's clear that people are going to be more concerned about North Korea if it starts ramping up its testing, not only, of course, potentially ICBM tests, but also potentially resuming nuclear tests. And if we were to conduct this survey at a time when North Korea is increasing its tests, we might find that it is a higher level of concern among all age cohorts.
Thanks, Bonnie. We had a question also, and I'll let Jude start on this one. But somebody asked, the survey shows a pretty robust appetite among the American thought leaders to push back on technology and on human rights and to defend allies. And we did this survey so people know in the first half of August. But the question is this sustainable with all the bruises the U.S. has taken from the pandemic and the economy? Is this really what we're going to look like in a year? Are we going to have the wherewithal to compete? I'll let Jude start on that one.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and I think one that looms and lingers over the United States. One of the interesting things coming out of the pandemic is this has, in terms of propaganda in Beijing, they're leveraging this as showing the inherent superiority of the political institutions overseen by the Communist Party of China, in distinction to what they see as the inherent failings in Western liberal democracy. I think looking at where the framing of the question that was just asked to us, I think it's really a matter of focus by the United States and allies on where and how we push back. I think just building on the question that was put to Bonnie on cooperation and where we're going to see concerted pushback, one of the muscles we're going to have to develop here is twofold. One is thinking about how we align with allies and partners on some of these key areas beyond the simple bumper sticker of working together with allies and partners. We've been hearing that for years now. The real tricky thing has been, although the survey results show that we have some pretty robust alignment on issues, we're still struggling to find traction on how specifically we thread the needle on some of these thornier issues where we're not facing binaries of full ally support versus opposition. We have a spectrum of where allies and partners stand on some of these really thorny issues, especially when they have to do with economic trade-offs, as we see in the case of technology, trade, and interdependence. This is not a binary. Folks often want to fall somewhere on a spectrum. The second muscle I was going to say we need to develop is, you hear climate change as being one of the areas where the United States needs to cooperate with China. There's a couple difficulties there, but I think as just one framing or big thought is, we need to think about how we will actually cooperate with this administration in Beijing when we have rivalry in so many other areas. So this is going to be a new type of cooperation, and how do we bracket, bucket, cordon off cooperation on, let's say, something like climate, even if there were an alignment between the US and Washington on that, when we have so many other frictions in the relationship. And also we have to remember that even on climate change, which is often the one kind of fill in the blank, where will we cooperate? China's got more coal-fired capacity under development right now than the US and India. China's doubling down on digging up out of the ground and burning hydrocarbons. So even when we hear China sort of put forward an appetite for cooperation on climate change, it's dealing with the exigencies of economic growth. And I dare say competition with the United States will, if anything, incentivize China to boost economic growth come hell or high water. And so that may put climate change cooperation at risk. So I think, we still haven't, even if we want to cooperate with China on cooperation on climate change, we have just an extraordinary thicket of issues we need to wade through before we can get traction there.
Thanks. I think the next one's probably for Scott. We'll have to be brief because we're getting to the end, but somebody asked, with billions flowing into the Chinese bond market and US industry revolting against trade sanctions, especially in 5G, isn't China going to win the tech war? I would just say, in terms of the results of the survey, we did see a very consistent, 2/3 across all the surveys among many sectors favoring banning Huawei and Chinese companies from 5G. But when we asked specific questions about export controls in tech, it was much more mixed. Somewhere around a third to 40% supported that, and most of those were not in industry. So I think the answer is, doesn't it look like industry doesn't agree with these survey results? Actually, I think this shows you exactly where industry is. They are prepared to ban Huawei. They just don't want to do it alone without allies and partners, and they don't want to do it in ways that are, rushed and damaging to them. But I'll turn it over to Scott about who's going to win the tech war in 90 seconds or less.
Well, the survey tells us what people feel. It doesn't give you an objective analysis of what the balance sheet is in the record. It obviously shows a great deal of concern, and the media and others have been paying a great attention to China's high-tech drive, and the Chinese are good propagandists as well. I think the U.S. is in still pretty strong position across most industries, particularly when you throw in our allies and partners in Asia and Europe. But yes, the Chinese have made a lot of progress. They're no backwater at all, but neither are we, and we still have a lot of juice in this engine. Nevertheless, this is a real competition. The Chinese are making significant progress, and we are not going to continue to move forward unless we really focus. And part of that is about having a textured policy on export controls and investment restrictions, decoupling with a small d, but it also means greater investment in U.S. industries. We didn't really ask much about industrial policy, but that's a word folks hear more today. Louis' colleagues that he talks with on Capitol Hill talk more about industrial policy across party lines. And so we're going to hear about that. I do think what is interesting is that we've lost a little bit of the dialogue and idea that interaction with China is good for our high-tech drive as well, and for theirs. And so we're going to need to be able to find, where can we continue to collaborate with China and do business with China, even in high-tech, and protect our national security at the same time, and also protect ourselves against Chinese theft of IP, et cetera. So again, it's about threading a needle, finding some type of Goldilocks policy. And I think there's going to be an effort for that. And if we can't, then we will turn to a much more harder line. There's plenty of bills sitting on Capitol Hill and ideas waiting to be executed in the executive branch, upping pressure, not cooperation. So I think it's either going to be figuring out how to walk and chew gum at the same time, or just going in a much more hardline direction. And either way, it's a huge challenge for us.
So very last question I'll slip in, since this is the political system season. One person asked, what are the implications for a potential Biden administration? And I think there are some. I'm not advising the Biden campaign, but there are a couple of things I would look at if I were thinking about a possible Biden administration. Overall, we asked in Europe and Asia which candidate would be better positioned to deal with China. And 61% said Donald Trump, 61% said Joe Biden, 18% said Donald Trump. Not a single European, we had 450 responses, I think. Not a single European said Donald Trump would be better. So pretty strong endorsement of a Biden presidency to deal with China. But there's some big caveats and things a Biden administration would have to think about. Number one, while most people blame the current friction on the Trump administration, it's pretty clear in the numbers that they do not think that means that China as a problem will go away. There are pretty fundamental issues on human rights, on security, and on tech that are going to still be there. Number two, as we've been discussing, there is an overlap in the Venn diagram. There is a basis for building coalitions, plural, on issues, but it's not just going to suddenly appear magically. Allies are important, but allies are in some ways still all over the place on certain issues, and it's going to take a lot of hard diplomacy. I think people will realize that. And then third and lastly, there were two countries where thought leaders believe that a second Trump term would be better in terms of dealing with China, and those were India and Vietnam. And if you think about it, those are the two countries that are getting hit the hardest by China right now in terms of coercion. And next below them was Taiwan, where there was a narrow preference or narrow belief that a Biden presidency would be better at China. So I think the fact that those on the front lines are more skeptical about a Biden administration should be something that a Biden team would want to think about. And how do they convey perhaps more, these are not treaty allies, India and Vietnam, but they're important partners and they're on the front line. So how a new administration, if it's a Biden administration, would convey a strong sense of support for an open Indo-Pacific and against coercion. It's an important question because people in Vietnam or in India are asking, and they're the ones most under the gun. But again, this is not a predictive survey. It's a serving suggestion. It illustrates the contours of coalitions at home and abroad to manage China policy. Some of the thinking about the mix of competition and cooperation, and really the basis we hope for a national dialogue and a dialogue with allies and partners about how to get a strategy on China that's enduring and that maximizes our interests and stability and prosperity in the world. So with that, I want to thank my colleagues across CSIS for all the hard work. Thank you for joining us. The site's up. Enjoy. You can explore it any number of ways, but that's all up to you. And we look forward to your feedback and ideas for the next round of this. Thank you again.